All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday, October 20th, 2021 meeting of the task force from the Arizona State Board of Pharmacy regarding rule rewrites. My name is Lori Walmsley, and I'll call the meeting to order at 1 o'clock. Dr. Gandhi, can you go ahead and take attendance and roll, please?
Certainly, Madam Chair. Ms. Walmsley.
Present.
Ms. Nair. Ms. Nair. Mr. Dang. Mr. Dang. Mr. Pond. Mr. Pond. It looks like he's just joining. I'll circle back with him. Ms. Ho.
Here.
Ms. Fine. Kelly, you're on mute.
Here.
There we go. Ms. Nishi.
Present.
Mr. Bozen.
Here.
Mr. Morris.
Here.
Ms. Sutcliffe.
Here.
Ms. Almer. Ms. Almer and Mr. Pond again. I do see him.
Here.
Okay, I understand Mr. Dang may be occupied towards the beginning of our meeting, but may join towards the latter part about it. I did send out an email, Madam Chair, to everybody about the assigned sections, and Mr. Dang did get me his assigned section, so we can review it without his presence. I don't know if we can capture his thoughts and what he wrote down and why he wrote down what he did, but we could always hang on to it till he attends.
Yeah, I'd like to hold off on that. Just one point of order. Does anybody have any declarations of conflicts of interest before we move on to the meat of the agenda?
I work for BV Medical Systems, and we make automated dispensing machines, which I think we have some regulations for. So that's it. Karen Nishi.
Okay, thank you, Karen. Dr. Gandhi, yes, I would say let's hold off on that. I read through the suggestions that Dr. Dang provided, and I wasn't following a couple of them, so I think it might be beneficial to have his perspective. So maybe let's jump into the next one that was assigned to Matt regarding returning of drugs and devices, R4 23409.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, R4 23409, returning drugs and devices. Most of this, it appears, was really pertaining to more of the retail section in hospitals that has the carve out for the hospital inpatient definition, and long-term care facilities, and how this doesn't really apply. Couple concerns on this, especially during COVID and living in Arizona hot summers. If any of this needs to be refreshed with COVID considerations, and I'm not really sure how the pharmacist could tell if a product had been subject to contamination or deterioration. Okay, thanks, appreciate that.
It would be
Thanks, Matt.
difficult.
I'm sorry, Karen, you're kind of echoing there.
It would be difficult to tell if a unit dose medication that has been returned to the bin or pocket has been heated or got too hot or something like that. So we could just say you just can't return it to the pocket, or you could return it to a return bin, and then that bin would have to be examined by a pharmacist once it's returned to the pharmacy.
Thank you. Additional feedback from any of the other committee members?
Lori, I have a thought on this, but it's slightly different than the issue we're talking about, but I want to
Yeah.
talk about it before we move on to 409. I'm just not sure if we're there yet.
Go ahead, Roger. I had a thought too, but go ahead and.
Sure. So one of the issues that's come up in the past in front of the board is on this section. There are a number of there were some pharmacies, I think Humana might have been the example at the time, but I think there are others that dispense prescriptions to patients in sealed bottles akin to manufacturer bottles, where they actually put a tamper-proof label on, a tamper-proof seal on it. And the board had approved those as being allowed to be returned and reused because they had that tamper seal on it. Given that that was one of the policies of the board, I thought since we're doing the rule right, we should incorporate that into the rule.
I would agree with you. I think Express Scripts from memory had something like that too.
Yeah, I think Dennis's idea from a long time ago. Yeah.
My only other thought, I had a couple of other thoughts here too. So I definitely understand the consideration around the temperature excursions and things like that, and think that that's something that we need to evaluate. Although I think that that's incorporated in the pharmacist evaluation to determine if the product is safe for reuse. But we're not always talking about prescriptions that are shipped. These could be products that are perhaps delivered by a courier, delivered by a team member, a technician, something like that, where the patient wasn't available. And I would hate for those drugs not to be able to be reused if we get too restrictive here either. The other thought I had is, I know we were working on the donation rules. Do those need to be incorporated into this section, or do we need to call out that there are those additional rules for donation? I just think it could be a little bit confusing for the public if you didn't know to look for the other, since that is the reuse of medications that had been previously dispensed.
What are you thinking? Just making it some kind of reference? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I was contemplating, should we put in there like a section, perhaps like a section D. This does not apply to medications that are reused within a formal donation program, and maybe reference that rule, something like that, just to make sure that it's clear that there are slightly different requirements for the medications within a donation program than what we're talking about here.
And then something about undelivered medications, undeliverable.
No, I think that that's covered with an A. I don't know that we need to make any adjustments for that.
I have one other comment though. I think other states actually put in a whole separate section for donation of medications that have been dispensed. So we could just reference to see that, like you had brought up, Emily, just a reference to look over here for donations. But this section doesn't address actually placing the medication into the machine. Like a nurse can actually return it to the machine, but if it's an e-kit or a box, an automated system in a long-term care facility, Arizona's rules require that the pharmacy or pharmacy personnel actually stock that unit. So that's become very difficult during times of COVID, because then they have to gown up, they have to put on PPE, they have to make an appointment to get into the facility. And it's just really to restock an emergency drug box, which is automated. So I'm hoping that we could take a look at that section of actually filling these machines.
Dr. Gandhi, I don't think that applies in the section of B, does it? I think that there's another area of law that we would need to address that in, right?
That is correct. So when
Yes,
we get to, when we get to the automated dispensing units
Okay.
and stuff like that, we can address it. This actually carves out a hospital inpatient settings and long-term care facilities and stuff. So returning of drugs doesn't, the prohibition doesn't apply to those guys.
And my lack of experience in the retail space here really wanted to defer to Roger and others on what has come up to the board before, when maybe it could be possibly spelled out more clearly here to make more efficient use of the board's hearings, was kind of my thought process on this.
I had the exact same notes as Roger and Lori around the previous waivers. And I also think those waivers actually ended up being for donation. So they had resealed the containers and then made them available for donation. So it was kind of like both of those topics combined. So I think it'd be nice to be able to call that out here in some way.
This is Mark Bozen, my recollection of some of the approved waivers that go back a long time. And I remember a very impressive presentation by one of the Midwestern pharmaceutics professors, Bill Bowman, I believe, on behalf of, I want to say it was Humana Right Source, but I may be wrong. It doesn't really matter. But it was a program by which the pharmacy had a technology that could put tamper-evident foil on a standard amber vial. And if that drug was returned unmolested to the pharmacy, it could be resold to another patient, absent the donation program. And because of the technical evidence that was presented by the scientists, the board approved it. And frankly, I don't know if that program still exists. I don't know if they're still doing that, but to Mr. Pond's point, I don't recall, and it's anecdotal knowledge, of a specific issue related to a case pertaining to a resold medication by a pharmacy and an issue that the board adjudicated, but I haven't been to every meeting and every hour of every meeting. So I would be supportive of is there a way we can codify some of these approved waivers because they seem to have been successful, arguably probably decrease drug shortage issues, and haven't presented any concern on a patient safety side.
I'm just wondering if we can amend A1 to just say after unopened container and put or equivalent container, and that might accomplish what we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking about is clarifying that statement there, Roger. And I think number 2 addresses the concerns around deterioration, which would address the heat concerns and those kinds of things as well. So I don't know that we need to make any adjustments there. Any other suggestions?
Madam Chair, and number 2, contamination deterioration, should we put a time frame, like if it is beyond 5 days or something like that? I don't know what the appropriate, that it can't be. That would address your delivery or technician delivery or whatever, because that would happen within a day or 2, it being returned back to the pharmacy.
I don't know what that right amount of time is. It would be my concern.
I agree with Lori. I hate to give someone a metric and thereby default say, gosh, if it's been 5 days or less, then the board must be okay with it. Because there'll be the exceptions on both sides of the rule. There'll be the exception to the, gosh, this thing was really fragile and it probably, in the pharmacist's opinion, ought to be destroyed because it was very fragile from the moment it left the pharmacy. And I don't feel comfortable dispensing. We give the pharmacist cover for making that decision for a very quick turnaround. But on the other hand, if there is very, very good excursion data, and I have a manufacturer client that has a refrigerated medication that has 12 days of excursion data below 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can be safely re-refrigerated, that's the other extreme of, you know, if the manufacturer has data that shows it's safe for that period of time, and I have confidence that it was stored below that temperature, then this also gives me the flexibility as a pharmacist to make the right call.
I agree. If this was before me, I think I would go ahead and read the package insert and see what that specific medication's temperature requirements are and see if it fits. I think it would just be part of the evaluation in number 2.
And just to compound Emily, and it's often not going to be in the package insert, but with the medical information department at the manufacturer. Excursion data for vaccines, for example, is usually available from the medical information department, but not on the FDA approved label.
So leave it as is.
That would be my vote. Any additional feedback on this section? All right. Thank you, Matt, for being prepared to discuss that one. Next up, I guess, let's move to Mark with our 423, 410 current good compounding practices.
Happy to discuss, Mark Bozen. So I spent a lot of time reviewing our language, and candidly, the only suggestion that I have is that we make lowercase the in 3 subsection D pharmacy compounding practice, make lowercase those items because they're not capitalized letters in the official compendia anymore. We refer to them as USP 795 and 797, but if we make them lowercase, those are certainly the official pharmacy compounding sections of the pharmacopoeia. I'm sorry, it's B3 little d. And the reason why I don't want to change it to USP 795 and 797 is I will be leaving out USP 800 because it's not compendial yet, and we'll have to come back later and add 800. And heaven forbid USP change the chapter numbers. Then we'll have to come back and change them. Heaven forbid USP creates more chapters related to different kinds of compounding, which would be their prerogative. So I like the use of pharmacy compounding practices, and you could say chapters, now that I'm reading it one more time carefully, of the official compendium, unless the board, unless there is published or unpublished stability data that is for a longer period of time. So what this section frankly has done is serve the state of Arizona very well. I can think of countless examples, 2 specifically, if the team would like to hear them, about where this chapter has served us well and given the Board of Pharmacy the appropriate guidance and flexibility to make some interesting calls as it relates to certain compounding practices. It does require us generally to follow state and federal guidelines. As we know, the feds have a number of guidelines that the pharmacies are responsible for entertaining. This language is not necessarily contradictory, but it does allow Arizona pharmacists the appropriate flexibility to compound safely for their patients, while also deferring when appropriate to federal guidelines that the board can adopt for various reasons.
Thanks, Mark. So all I'm hearing is a couple of typographical changes under that section 3 little b, just to clean up the language so that it is more correct with current terminology, at least from your perspective.
Yeah, and just for the editor, I think this is Cam driving the mouse. Yeah, it's little d as in Delta, and there it is. Little p, little c, little p in those 3 words, and then chapters instead of chapter. And it doesn't change the intent, but it does broaden it to include any of the chapters in USP/NF that might be applicable to the practice of pharmacy or a practice of compounding pharmacies.
Thanks, Mark. Any other suggestions from other committee members?
Hey, Mark, since you're the expert in compounding here, how much does this vary from USP 795, 797?
It doesn't vary at all, but full disclosure, what I will say is something that we should probably discuss is scroll up just a little bit. In that same section, little Edward, little Foxtrot, this whole section talks about candidly dispensing for office administration. Now, originally I thought, gosh, the FDA in section 503A, the DAMA 97, some of the other statutory changes that the United States Congress has made, has said, gosh, 503A pharmacies, those are pharmacies filling prescriptions pursuant to a patient-specific prescription, ought not be compounding for office use. But we need to leave this in here, in my opinion, because the 503B pharmacies / manufacturers whose only job is to compound for office use ought to be held to the same standards as it relates to good compounding practices for the state of Arizona. So there are pharmacies out there that are compliant with federal law that do compound for office use. And Cam, as I read this section, the authors of this section did a really nice job of writing the regulations in such a way as to not be so specific that as changes to 795 and 797 presented, that they would be in conflict. It's a fairly simple section, fairly elegant, and candidly, I can see all of USP and federal law fitting in here when you consider the entire universe of pharmacies that compound.
Thanks, Mark. Anything additional from other committee members on this section?
This is Matt. In this section, does it talk about in hospitals that the final verification and sterile compounding has to be within the 4 walls, or is that discussed somewhere else?
This section, and I'm perusing it again, doesn't describe verification specifically in that way, but it does describe the record keeping requirements.
Okay.
I'm looking for that right now.
And maybe when we come to that section, that was just something that was a struggle with so much being virtual now, being able to do the final verification virtually through the use of technology as opposed to being within the 4 walls, I think was something that was raised in the past. I don't see it in this section. You're more familiar with it. That's what I was asking, and we can put a pin in that.
If we go to section I, indigo, subsection 2, I think this is where you may be getting at some of the issues. This talks about components for pharmaceutical product compounding are accurately weighed, measured, or subdivided to ensure that each weight, measure, or subdivision is correct as stated in the compounding procedures, comma, a pharmacist, checks and rechecks or assumes responsibility for checking and rechecking the operations at each stage of the compounding process and documents by handwritten initials or signature the completion and accuracy of the compounding process. It doesn't say that necessarily you have to be standing there right next to the person. It doesn't say that it can't be done virtually, and those handwritten initials or signatures need to be a wet signature on the batch formulation log that the person has done. If you had a system whereby you could write those initials or signature, maybe we could even talk about the word handwritten or some other electronic initials or signature. I can picture a process, particularly in a sterile compounding world, where I'd have some sort of closed circuit computerized or closed circuit television that would allow me to communicate and visualize things remotely in such a way as for particularly a sterile technician to say, hey, can you check the next step now before I go on? Doesn't require the pharmacist to gown up, get sterile, potentially break the sterile field by going in there and handwriting anything. So Matt, if that's an issue, and the hospitals in particular, I would like to clarify that this might be one of those places to do that.
Yeah,
And-
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Matt.
And I appreciate that. That is something just from workflow standpoint on, somebody's talking earlier about gowning up and going into the IV room and all of what is required. And there are products and technologies out there, without naming manufacturers, that have made that service available for a number of years that we've been able to use in other states. And I think it would be advantageous if our rules and regs embrace that too.
Yeah, I think we should look at, to your point, Mark, about the handwritten initials. I don't see a reason why electronic documentation wouldn't be sufficient, just like we have in a lot of our other processes. If the pharmacist is able to do that safely remotely, I don't know why they would need to stand next to the person and document it on paper.
Well, okay, so now's our opportunity. I don't mind striking the words handwritten and just saying documents by initials or signatures, the completion and accuracy of the compounding process. And thereby we get rid of the wet signature connotation there of handwritten. But I do want to make sure that the hospitals and this committee, before we go on this, are comfortable that a technology that I would argue is safer, if I'm doing sterile compounding and I can adequately view the steps of the process remotely, even if it's, you know, just in the other room, I would argue that would be a safer process as to not bring in other people, particularly a pharmacist. And I was a pharmacist who worked at a busy compounding laboratory, albeit in the retail/mail order area. As a busy pharmacist, yes, when I needed to go into the clean room, I would respect the lines of demarcation, gown up, make sure I was sterile. But candidly, since I wasn't planning on touching anything and I was going to go in and out, I may have gone faster than I should have in certain areas, and just been very, very careful not to touch anything once I got in there. Whereas if there was a camera and it allowed me to record things electronically, I don't think that offends any part of the national form, the USPNF, or the intent of this section. As long as, but I do stand by that whether it's that there needs to be a pharmacist who has supervision capabilities of which they're comfortable. So maybe this subsection 2 Bravo could be documents by initials or signature for the completion and accuracy of the compounding process, whether that be physically present or remote technology. I don't know, Matt, you're familiar with those systems. Maybe there's better words I could be using.
Do we need to clarify that if we take away the handwritten?
Well, I wonder if Matt, you said it's used widely in other states. Have there been concerns by inspectors in your systems, in your experience, where they said, gosh, I'm not comfortable with using closed caption television because of this rule? And is this even the rule that they were citing if that was the case? Or are the inspectors more concerned about other sections of our law that deal with supervision in general and what is direct versus indirect supervision? Those are debates Roger and I have on a daily basis, 50 times for 50 different states.
Well, I kind of think, to Emily's point, maybe we don't need to by not clarifying it, we clarify it. And the inspectors that I've encountered in other states, the electronic verification and the record keeping that is done by the camera systems is so much far superior over what we used a few years ago that was just manual paper keeping, that they have not had issue with it that I've encountered.
And Mark, from a compliance officer's perspective, I think if they had either a picture capture device technology or something like that, we've been okay. And I think Sandy's on this call as well, and she can correct me if I'm wrong, but as long as there's some sort of virtual or physical supervision.
Hi, this is Sandy. We've had a number of pharmacies with technology that they've used to check sterile compounding for a number of years, and they work quite well. Some of the concerns that we come across is if the technology goes down, what do they use for their backup? They sometimes miss that component of it. That's just part of their SOPs that they need to address. But the use of the technology itself, if they're capturing everything that we need, is fine.
Matt, I think maybe the language about like 4 walls or being on site that you're thinking of might just be related to like having drugs on site and needing the pharmacist to be on site when the people are in the pharmacy, not specific to checking a compound.
Yeah, I'm going back and looking through my notes to see if I can find that reference and just put a pen in it for now.
I think, yeah, that sort of 4 walls issue, does the pharmacist have to be in the 4 walls of the licensed pharmacy and or the 4 walls of the compounding room, or you name the room? I think when we get to sections about supervision and what is direct supervision, what is indirect supervision, I think those are the places, if there need to be cleanup, that's probably more related to the 4 walls question.
This is Sandy again. I will say the one issue that we do see, I won't say frequently, but we do see it, has to do with 2 paragraph A, where it talks about checking and rechecking the operations at each stage of the compounding process. We do sometimes find where we're getting final verifications, but not checks of the products prior to compounding.
And I will validate that. I'm not an inspector, but I have worked in pharmacies and compounded for many years, and I consult for pharmacies. And I like paragraph 2A. I do not like, and this is, in my opinion, where a lot of compounding errors happen, is the compound comes out of the compounding room in its finished dosage form, sometimes with the stock bottles that were used, sometimes not. And I've seen pharmacists just check all the boxes. Yep, I saw the weight on this and I did the weight on this, and they do the final verification all in one shot. That makes me nervous. That is not best practice. And I like keeping in the provision then. And I don't know that it needs any changes, because I think it is pretty clear that you're responsible, pharmacist, for verifying things throughout the process, not just at the very end.
Sorry, I was on mute there. So any other suggestions from the group?
A
Lori,
topic, I don't know if it
Go
would
ahead.
fit in here, in talking about allowing, and I think we've touched on this in past rewrite committee meetings, but allowing health systems to function as a shared service in sterile compounding, being able to do some of the batching on high volume movers that maybe are made in one pharmacy at the health system and then used by another hospital within that health system, as opposed to having USP 800 resources in every single hospital, working more like a shared service. This may not be the place for that, though.
I don't think we've gotten to, because I think it's in the 600s, the section on shared services. It strikes me that there might be a place in the shared services regulation to discuss that.
Hey, Roger, correct me if I'm wrong. Didn't FDA just issue a guidance allowing for a hospital to share compounded products with common ownership?
Yeah, I think it's common ownership.
Yes.
I think they have a draft guidance out, but they're accepting comments, I think, right now, I thought.
I think that's correct, yeah.
Okay. So, man, it is being worked on, I guess, from an FDA perspective.
Thank you.
Roger, did you have something else to add?
I had three issues I wanted to kick around. On section B2, I've never quite understood B2. So can someone explain to me what it's actually referring to? It says, before compounding a pharmaceutical product in excess of the quantity dispensed in anticipation of receiving valid prescriptions. So I read that before I start compounding something based on what I anticipate receiving. So this is above what I think I'm going to get. So why would I compound something that beyond what I think I'm going to get?
Roger, if I could jump in, this is how I interpreted that section, and people let me know if I'm crazy. So generally when I'm compounding, let's take capsules, for example. The prescription might be once a day dosing and call for 30 capsules. It is safer, easier, and my machinery, meaning my capsule making machine, does 100 at a time. And so what this does is it allows me to compound 100, even if I only need 30. And what it's also doing is it's saying, it's sort of incorporating in a less elegant way the anticipatory compounding provision of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that, or at least the enforcement that the FDA has of that. This is why you can compound 100 capsules of this thing, even though the prescription in front of you only calls for 30.
I agree, Mark, I agree with you as to that you can do it anticipatorily, but I think the clause already says that in excess of the quantity dispensed in anticipation. I think this is saying before I do even beyond what I anticipate. That's what I'm confused about.
I see.
Which I don't. And then the second portion of part two with this one is I don't understand why why it has in there the pharmacist employed by the pharmacy permittee. Who else is going to be doing this? I don't understand why we need the words employed by the pharmacy permittee and what it's adding there. Doesn't matter. And then the third piece of just this comment here is shall establish a history of compounding valid prescriptions. So before I either using your definition, Mark, do anticipatory, or before mine using even above anticipatory, I can't do anticipatory at the beginning. I can only do actual ones. And how many do I have to do?
Well, there you go. That's the age-old question. What's the threshold? And at least in my experience, and frankly, my experience with the FDA in that field of offices, they know it when they see it. What's valid and what's not. I'd love to clean up this section. If you've got some good suggestions, I'd be supportive of that.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering if we just want to say a pharmacy permittee may prepare anticipatory compounded product. I mean, I wouldn't be much more explicit, but I don't know, Cam, did you have something on that? I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I just said pursuant to federal guidelines.
That's fine. I just, as we're cleaning this up, that clause has always just felt awkward to me. All right, so that was my first issue, Lori.
Okay.
My second one is B3. Neither the pharmacy permittee nor the pharmacist employed by the permittee provides a compounded pharmaceutical product to a pharmacy, a medical practitioner, or other person. I'm not clear who the other person is, but let's assume that's for everything, for dispensing or distributing, except that a compounded product may be provided to a medical practitioner to administer. How does the pharmacy permittee know what the medical practitioner is going to be doing with the product?
In this case, Roger, the way I've always interpreted this section is that for office administration, I don't know, frankly, what the patient is that's going to need this medication. But what I do warn the doctor in the little e and little f below is you can't redispense this, doctor. It's for office or hospital administration only. And so, yes, doctor, I'll sell you a batch of this. But if you're not giving me a patient name and I'm compliant with all the other federal state rules, I'm going to put not for dispensing and for hospital office administration only, so that you know that I believe this is what you're going to use it for, and you're not going to dispense this, send it home with the patient, and especially you're not going to create a compounding pharmacy using my products that you've ordered from me and just resell them.
So how does this work in connection with 503B pharmacy then?
Well, so that's what's interesting. I thought about, do we strike this provision, which is essentially office use compounding? Well, if there was no section 503B, then we would, but there is a section 503B, and it is my understanding that Arizona licenses in both as pharmacies and as manufacturers, but I could be wrong. Cam and Sandy, do they have both licenses, or can they just be a manufacturer in some cases?
They are just a manufacturer in our model.
So they're just a manufacturer. So then do I need to clean up? So then does number 3 then need to be cleaned up? There are no pharmacy permittees then that can dispense to a prescriber for office use. Or then I get wrapped around the axle. I thought of that, which is why I was very careful to touch this. What about the pharmacies that only compound within the state of Arizona and never engage in interstate commerce? Are they still allowed to compound for office use? And I'm not sure the board, I'm not going to ask the board staff to opine on that right now unless they want to. But, and this is the age-old argument, if a pharmacy is not engaged in interstate commerce, is the practice of compounding subject to their jurisdiction? And should we leave this in there for a case in which a pharmacy can simultaneously be in compliance with Arizona law and federal law by virtue of them not engaging in interstate commerce?
All right, so cut to the chase. Is there a suggested change here? There may not be. I said when I looked at it, those ones just struck me as strange.
Here's what I can tell you. And this is just my personal experience. It's not that of an attorney. As a compounding pharmacy as a pharmacist who operated in pharmacies that compounded, and I did that for many, many years, and I still advise pharmacies on that. I found these rules to be restrictive enough to be safe, but not so restrictive as to overcome issues that are unique to compounding. By virtue of compounding, you're dealing with an odd set of circumstances that commercially available medications just don't fit well. And these sections have not been confusing to us. I haven't had any run-ins with the inspectors where we disagreed about interpretation of these items. And that's why I thought, gosh, let's leave well enough alone unless there are folks on this committee who've got a different experience and a different perspective. And Roger, you're right. 2 and 3 have some interesting drafting. I mean, we could get rid of especially the language pharmacist employed by the permittee. I mean, what if they're independent contractors or temporary? I mean, getting rid of those sections is probably important. Should be neither a pharmacist nor permittee nor a pharmacist. Get rid of employed by the pharmacy permittee, because that just seems unnecessary, because we don't usually use that language in other parts of the code. But I candidly haven't had an issue interpreting these, and at least understanding what the board's expectations were, the board inspector's expectations were, and it always seemed pretty clear to me, unless others want to clean it up.
Okay. And then my final issue, Lori, and I just throw
Roger,
this out because
Roger, before you move on, did
Yeah.
you have any suggestions on what you wanted to do with that section? The other one, I think Cam captured what you wanted in 2 with the update, and then striking everything before that he has highlighted in yellow, right?
That was the intent, is what and we'll wordsmith it
Okay.
yeah.
after the
And
fact.
then and then what was your suggestion for 3, or was it just discussion?
It was more discussion on 3 because I just didn't know where we were going with it. I can live with that. That's fine.
Okay.
And then my final one is, I just throw this out here because we've had the question come up a number of times. Why do we prohibit 2 commonly owned pharmacies from having one compounded product and have it put on the shelf of both of them? We know they can move other inventory around. Why don't we allow compounded product? And I just wanted to make sure we discussed it, and if that was something we thought was beneficial, we should talk about it. The arguments pro are that you may have safer equipment, people with better technology. Why do we need it compounded in 2 different places? I presume the argument that's con is we want people to do it in their own pharmacy and it looks like manufacturing.
So this is Mark. I have some experience that is quite old and not codified of receiving a variance for the sharing of compounds amongst commonly owned pharmacies. The argument then was, to your point, the equipment and the expertise that the staff had at pharmacy A and the space that the pharmacy staff had at pharmacy A was superior to that of pharmacy B, and it created better access to the patients. It got the drugs closer to the patients and created a safer system. The con, to your point, Roger, might be the perception that these are larger batches than we usually see because you're compounding for 2 or 3 or more pharmacies, and this is a really large batch, and this feels like manufacturing, except for it's within a commonly owned pharmacy. And I think the FDA's proposal recognized that this has created problems in the hospitals. Why would we treat the hospitals any differently than the other commonly owned pharmacies? And do we have an opportunity in this rulemaking to describe the ability for pharmacies under common ownership to prepare compounded medication in anticipation of receiving a prescription at the other pharmacies if they're under common ownership? I like it. I think that's a good suggestion. It worked very, very well in my experience, and probably led to a superior product and fewer errors because we were able to utilize equipment, space, and people at one place and not have to replicate all of that in more than one place. And there are no patient safety issues. Despite the fact we were supposed to track them, we didn't find any patient safety issues related to that, what we call batch compounding for our other pharmacies.
You don't see that in conflict with the FDA and what a manufacturer is?
No, I don't. Because at the end of the day, it's still filling a prescription, compounding pursuant to a patient-specific prescription or anticipation of a patient-specific prescription. The batch size has always been and I talked about it earlier, is sort of this Potter Stewart, I know it when I see it ruling. And I've talked to inspectors who say, look, the guidance is unclear as to, there is no batch size that makes it manufacturing versus not manufacturing. But there are certain red flags, if you will. The red flags are, they're not uniquely customized. And maybe this is some of the deficit is if a prescriber really wants a 15% topical cream, but the batch that just came from the other pharmacy is a 12% topical cream, which for all intents and purposes is going to provide the same therapeutic outcome. And so you're asking the doctor to change their prescription from 15% to 12% because that's the batch that's available. And you do that over and over again. Have you inadvertently launched a new drug into the market without an NDA? There are pros and cons and arguments on either side. But at the end of the day, you don't see that very often. You usually you're basing it on a history. I'm only going to batch compound those things that the doctors write over and over and over again over a frequent period of time. I'm not going to try to sell the doctor on something that the doctor's never written for before. We're just trying to catch up with the doctor's prescribing habits or a hospital's prescribing habits. Mayo Clinic, for example, is one of those where we sent large volumes of compounded orders into the community, and we got to learn the prescribing habits of the Mayo doctors. And so we would try to catch up with the Mayo doctors and make what we anticipated them to order, which is absolutely allowed under federal and state rules. It's reasonable anticipatory compounding. So I think, Lori, the short answer to the question is, as long as you're doing this pursuant to a patient-specific prescription or in reasonable anticipation of a patient-specific prescription for it, I don't think it violates it, simply because the alternative is I can make just as big a batch and just send the patient to the other pharmacy or deliver it from the other pharmacy. The only thing I'm doing differently is I'm making it more accessible by moving it closer to the patient, which in some cases makes all the difference in the world. So there's no delay in care.
Dr. Gandhi, can we have our legal staff take a look at this just to make sure that there wouldn't be any conflicts federally? I appreciate the fact that Mr. Bozen has the legal experience as well, but just want to make sure that there aren't any conflicts there. I do worry a little bit the perception of manufacturing versus just dispensing a patient-specific prescription. Is that something that we could take jot this down as a subject, and then perhaps have our team come back with that at a later point in time, Dr. Gandhi?
Certainly, Madam Chair, we can take care of that.
Roger, was there any additional ones that you had?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Anything else on compounding from the other committee members?
Just one question, Madam Chair. I'll ask Mark, since he's the known compounding expert here. If and when, and who knows when, right, Mark, 795, 797 gets resolved, and when the dust settles, what's left? How much of this in 410 can we just rely on USP versus having it in our language as well?
Well, candidly, you're relying on USP for almost all of your enforcement right now, and I think that's the right thing to do. This mirrors USP. The only substantive change that I expect to come out of USP has to do with beyond use dating, which was the subject of the appeal and the subject of the remand. And you do have a section in here about BUD dating. It either defaults to the compendial. I think we're back to D. Here we go. Beyond use dating is based upon the pharmacist's professional judgment, but not more than the maximum guidelines recommended by the pharmacy compounding practice chapters. And so no matter what happens to 795 and 797, that still controls. But here's what might not control, because this wasn't in the 797 in particular. This wasn't in the 797 revision, which was the ability to utilize published or unpublished stability test data to show a longer period is appropriate. That was the subject of the appeal, and it was the contention of the three appellants that inability to give the pharmacy flexibility in the presence of additional data, stability testing data, that inability was going to just essentially make certain things that were absolutely critical to the health, safety, and welfare of Arizona patients and other patients in the United States inaccessible. And the default for the 797 wasn't going to let you expand it at all. And we thought that was unreasonable. There was no reason to set this artificial BUD dating and not give the pharmacist any ability to expand it in the presence of acceptable data. On the non-sterile side, the issue was, we'll let you extend it, but the unpublished stability data best to be a stability indicating method, which sounds right because it has all the right words in it, but a stability indicating method can cost upwards of $30,000 per batch. And you would wipe out the ability to extend the beyond use date of things that are not sterile, that haven't presented any patient safety issues at all in the data that the FDA presented to the USP. And so it might be at some point in the future, 3 Delta could conflict with whatever the USP settles on in 795 and 797. But for now, it's consistent with 795 and 797. And I would recommend leaving it the way it is until the USP resolves this. Because if the USP doesn't do a reasonably good job compromising, I'll guarantee you those appellants are going to march right back in there and pull it and appeal it again.
All right, Madam Chair, I think we're good to move to the next section if everyone's good with it.
Yep, sounds good. I think the next one up is Kristin section R423-411, pharmacist administered or pharmacy or graduate intern administered immunizations. Actually, we struck graduate in a previous iteration. Sorry. Okay, old notes up here.
We've already gone over my section. The only thing I had made a note was the immediate personal supervision of a pharmacist under 2. Did we already take that out? Yeah, okay. That's the only thing I had, really. We've already gone over this section, so is there anything anyone had to add that we haven't already discussed?
Yeah, any other feedback? I have some, but I'll take other committee members first.
We had kind of debated adding technicians to this section. And I thought that we'd landed on not adding them, that they had their own area.
That was correct, Chris.
That's honestly all I had.
Any other feedback from other committee members?
Lori, this is Kelly.
Yeah.
So a few things. There are some revisions for the section, but we are planning on running a Sunrise application this year. And so I'm not sure if it makes sense to clean this up or even refer maybe just to statute, especially for the authority part of it, and maybe just leave in specific rules on training and things that maybe aren't found in the statute. The statute's pretty specific. So I don't know if it makes sense to maybe skim over this and then come back to it, since we're going to be working on legislation.
That makes sense, Kelly. The one area that I had, just based on previous deviations, and I guess for disclosure, my company has a deviation for this very purpose, was around the physician notification and allowing the electronic notification versus fax notification. And I think the section there was regarding, I believe it's in.
I thought that's already corrected.
That is, it says electronic report. That's already in there. Number 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That was my only thing, is I wanted to make sure that we addressed it, because I think the board has approved 3 or 4 different deviations now for that. Okay.
So again, I think the end goal is whatever's spelled out in statutes. I don't know if we have to regurgitate the same thing in rule, reference it, and then add on any missing pieces of information. It is extending our regulation book. It's almost duplicative, and it doesn't make sense.
I agree.
All right, that was easy.
That was easy.
Good job, Kristin.
Next up, I think was Roger's section on emergency refill prescription dispensing, R423-412.
I had some suggested changes, but Cam appropriately pointed out to me that we're going to need to make statutory changes if we make the changes I'm suggesting. I still think we should, but it would also require statutory. And my changes are basically, I don't think the refill should be limited to a 30-day supply. I thought they should be for 90-day, could be refilled again. And then, as we've seen with the pandemic, all emergencies don't end in 30 or 60 days. So this ability to continue to do that during the full length of the emergency would continue as long as the emergency remains declared. But it would require some statutory changes also. So that's what I suggested.
I agree with you. Those were my notes, because the Governor Ducey's emergency order allowed for 90 days plus an additional 90 days that came out of the COVID task force. So I would be in support of those changes. Dr. Gandhi, I think you're keeping a list of potential statutory changes we need for next session.
Yes, I do have that. And Michelle Ulmer and I talked about some of those. And one of the biggest hurdles will be having that discussion with Medical Association and seeing if they're going to buy in on it. Outside of that, obviously it's worked out for us during this pandemic. And, I think it served the public well. But again, going back to a lot of this language here is already in statute. And if we can modify the statute, we may be able to redline a lot of this section again and not have it repeated.
Agreed.
The
Go ahead.
disclaimer in C does cover it a little bit, to some extent at least.
But it's limited to 2 30-day supplies. So when you think about COVID's been going on
Forever.
over a year and a half, and it doesn't make sense. Would it make sense that provision could be extended depending on the circumstances?
And maybe not put it at 90 day, I don't know.
Guess we will have to leave that for the legislature to figure out, but I would definitely be supportive in making it more broad. I think we haven't seen really a lot of issues coming out of this through the governor's executive order. So I think it's served the public well.
That was all I had on that one.
Thanks, Roger.
I don't know if anybody had anything else. And then I have the other one, the temporary recognition of a non-resident license, again, during an emergency. And I thought the rules as written relating to the statute were fine. I didn't see any issue there, but others may.
Thanks, Roger. Any feedback from the other committee members? I agree. I think this has served us well in COVID. There was a number of other states that were not so lucky that didn't have these provisions in place. And I think we were well set up because of these. All right, anything on either of those two sections? All right, let's move on to Kelly's assigned section R423, 415, impaired licenses, treatment and rehabilitation.
So I think Cam's going to pull up. I had submitted suggestions, and then in line with kind of what we've already stated about referencing and not repeating rules if statutes are specific. Basically, it would strike out everything, and I guess I didn't keep in all of the stricken language below. But I think we only need to reiterate kind of what the authority is and reference back to the statutes which are listed below. I put them in there just for reference so that everyone could see how detailed and everything pretty much that was in the rule was found in statutes. So we can either remove the rule knowing that there's a statute there, or just leave it brief, this little paragraph that says pursuant to. So my recommendation would be to strike everything and replace it with this language above, because we have two very thorough statutes that cover that process.
Thanks, Kelly.
Kelly, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Kelly, this is Mark Bozen. I'm pretty passionate about the recovery programs that we have, whether it's done by the foundation or one of the other contractors. And one of the things that concerns me about 2021 is I like the language, may establish a non-disciplinary confidential program. I don't know if this is something that needs to be fixed in statute or can be done in rule, but I'm always been uncomfortable with disciplinary action that is solely connected to someone's disease. And by virtue of having a PAPA contract, you have discipline. Now, there's a balance there, I know. Now, if the person engaged in discipline-worthy behavior, they stole medications, they violated a law, whether it be civil or criminal, that is secondary to their disease, discipline them on those grounds. But I don't like, and I don't know if this covers it, I don't like the contract itself being disciplinary. And that was always the intent of the program, was if someone were to approach a recovery program like PAPA and say, I'd like to get help, they could engage in a contract and it would be non-disciplinary. But if they relapsed, which frankly is part of the disease healing process and the recovery process, then it automatically shifted into discipline simply because they relapsed, even though there may not have been a crime or a patient safety issue. Is there something we can do, or is this just too big a topic to bring up now related to that?
Well, I think there's potentially some conflict in statute with the way things are worded. We had previous language, which I think was the 32-1932, and then we have a new section. Cam, I don't know if you can scroll down a little bit, that was added for the, this. And so I copied language out of here, and I don't know if we could maybe get feedback. I had done a little bit of research on how kind of the medical board and their statutes and rules read, and they do allow for what you're talking about, Mark, where it's kind of a non-disciplinary to the point where then it might become disciplinary. So we may have the language with the way this is worded to be able to modify some of that. I don't know if that would be a longer discussion somewhere else. I don't know legally where all of the different statutes may be in play that impact this. The two that I found, I copied in here, but I think maybe we can look and see how the physician boards are doing it, because I know our statute was copied off of what they do.
So back to Kelly's original suggestion of basically either strike all and modify it with just a basic sentence, or just strike it all, since we have the two statutes on the books. Dr. Gandhi, does that accomplish, is there anything there that we would lose by striking it all? From your standpoint? Or is it just a simple repeat of the statute?
I'm trying to see where the language basically mimics 32-1932, so it outlines kind of these reports. Cam, I don't know if you can pull up, and I apologize, I must have cut that part out. I meant to show the stricken language as well, but I'm trying to see if I can.
Can you see the whole screen, guys? It's side by side.
Yep. So current language is on the right, the proposed is on the left, right?
That's correct.
Looks like there isn't any references to the confidential participants versus the known participants, if we were to strike the whole rule.
Yeah, the statute doesn't, it only references confidential. So that was, because that's how we used to do it, but I know some of that's changed. Because you still have section D in there where it says the licensee who's impaired by alcohol or drug abuse may enter into stipulated order with the board, or the licensee may be placed on probation or be subject to other actions as provided by law.
But that would limit the ability for a confidential participant, would it not? This would only address known participants.
Well, the 32-3223 talks about confidential. In the RFP, when we had submitted, there is a lot of detail and reference to that. I'm not sure. And it talks about that stipulated agreement, and there can be confidential.
But that's
But I don't.
But that's also called out in the rule too, Kelly. What's required of the program. So if you look at 415C, it talks about the contract with the qualified organization shall include a minimum of, and it talks about what's included in the quarterly reports, including if the person is known or confidential, the clinical findings, yada, yada, yada. I think we would lose. I worry that we're going to lose the ability for both pathways for people to participate, because I think having a confidential tract if somebody self-identifies and it's not an issue of impairment at work or a substance, like theft of a substance or something like that, I still think it's the right thing for that person to be able to participate in the same level of monitoring and all those kinds of things without the board having to know about it unless there is something that becomes a concern.
The new agreement removed that total confidential component. It's board known now. Whether the public knows, that is a different story, but I don't know that we've ever finalized kind of what the procedures are for that. Yeah, in the new RFP, it doesn't allow for people to just come to us and say, hey, I have a problem. There's been no law violation, but just, hey, I have a problem, I want to get help. We used to have confidential participants in the program. We're no longer able to do that.
I remember that whole discussion.
You know, is potentially problematic. I think it discourages those people from coming forward until they have to, but that was, again, that's something that has already been decided, which maybe could be discussed at a future date.
But it's just known to the board. It's not known to the public.
Yeah, but how is that determined? I think that still needs to be figured out between the programs who are participating and board staff. Because I'm not aware of anybody that's fallen under that confidential stipulated agreement.
I believe we have a couple of them, Kelly, that are confidential. And again, they're marked confidential in the database, so it's not to be shared and only subject to sharing if they violate the contract with a substance use program.
So yeah, my intention is not to remove that. My feeling was that the statute, because it mentioned confidential, that it would cover the ability for the board to have both confidential and known. But in keeping B in there, if that's the case, then I would definitely say let's keep B for sure.
Additional feedback or comments on this?
So are we proposing your modification in A, or are we leaving A the way it was? Cal?
A was what I modified. So I just basically cut and pasted the statute in there and then reference to, and then if we left B, or maybe we just put pursuant to at the end or something of A and B, or combine those somehow. But the rest of it, the reporting and stuff, I think is even different and changed based on that. But the statute does talk about reporting, periodic reports. So I think a lot of that's still covered in there.
Cam, this is Seth. That change to A kind of doesn't really make sense, because under the statute, so it's giving the board the authority to establish the program. So having that same language in the rule makes no sense, because the program is kind of already being established in the statute. So putting again in the rule, the board may establish, it's kind of already been established by statute. Now you're setting forth the criteria in the rule.
Well, I guess we could just leave it to, if we just say the board may contract with qualified organizations to operate a program for the treatment and rehabilitation of licensees, impaired. This doesn't cover the mental health component that's new. I think we need to change this to substance use disorder instead of drug abuse, but as a result of substance use disorder, or how is it worded? Or we could put chemically dependent substance misuse history, and then to include the medical psychiatric pursuant to, maybe would be better.
Chemically dependent or substance use?
Well, the statute reads, they say chemically dependent or have a substance misuse history, or who may have a medical, psychiatric, psychological, or behavioral health disorder that may impact the licensee's or certificate holder's ability. Yeah.
I think the terminology of misuse is also important in the new statute, and Kelly had outlined it in her edits as well.
Did we change the title?
Mm-hmm.
Beyond just impaired licensees? I don't know what we change it to, because you really can't use that whole criteria where you were talking about the substance misuse, et cetera, and then the mental health components. But I don't know what we change it to, but I don't feel like it's inclusive of everything that is within the statute now.
Why don't you just change it to treatment and real rehabilitation for licensees?
Yeah.
I like it. Should you also include the reference to 32-32 to 23 there too, after the, so include both of the statutory references?
And all of the things that we have to do as a program, as far as like what we're obligated to do, are in the contract that we have through the state and the board. So that's why I think just striking it all out, because all of that's kind of already outlined in that, in the details of that contract that we have with the state.
If we were to strike that, do we lose the ability to say that's what's required of the program if it's not in rule?
Well, the staff
On the
says
RFP
you can,
process?
No, I don't think we lose, since it's included in the RFP and both parties have agreed to it. It's a contractual thing. So we don't lose the ability, no. Seth, correct me if I'm wrong.
I'm not
It is
sure.
about the report. On the other side, in that the first one, 30 on the left, yeah, it says written request by the board, release of treatment records, reports, quarterly reports, reporting if, you know, there's somebody who's a danger to themselves or others, if they were refusing treatment.
Lori, I think my take on it is obviously we have potentially sent one of our licensees to a place to get help, and it's up to that facility to ease the board's mind in order to maybe lift a suspension, lift a probation, allow this person to work again. So I'm not sure if it has to be spelled out in detail. I think Kelly would, if they can't satisfy our needs as a board, then it's whether the board wants to lift these things, these suspensions or probations or whatever at that point.
As long as we don't lose what we are getting, I'm okay with the concept of removing it. I don't know what you think, Kristin. I'm okay with it not being specifically spelled out in the rule, as long as we can still require it through the RFP process, and that we still get the reporting from the program administrators and things like that. I know Kelly's here on behalf of one of the programs, but I want to make sure that that doesn't change for any of the other programs that are contracted with the state as well.
I feel the same way.
I have a really small knowledge of this program and how it operates kind of in the background, but something that I'm curious about is if you do remove the info here that is spelled out in the contract, does that also cover folks who are confidentially in the program, or are they outside of the contract coverage?
So this report, Emily, is presented to the board. And on a generic level, the Kelly or the other organization can talk about, how other folks are participating and doing in the program, but they're not obligated to because they are confidential. Our concern is obviously just the ones that are known, and we'd like a recap on those and making sure they're compliant. If the folks that are confidential become non-compliant and not cooperative with Kelly's group or the other organization, it's Kelly's obligation through the RFP to let us know, and of course through statute and regulation. If we eliminated a lot of this, even through contractual agreement between the two parties, they'd be in violation of our contract, and we could term our agreement with them and go to another source.
Hi, everyone. This is Kevin. Sorry I joined late. Just finished my meeting.
Thanks, Kevin. So again, what's outlined in C, Madam Chair, is outlined in 1932.01 as well, most of it anyways. So I don't have a concern about redlining C if we need to.
We used to have a separate contract before we had to bid through the state, and so that's where these rules came into play. There was a separate contract that was filled out basically to facilitate this before we officially went through the bidding process formally through procurement.
So it's kind of a legacy before we had the contract.
Right.
Okay. Well, as long as we're not losing anything, I don't see that there's a value in keeping it there. Does anybody feel differently?
Yeah, if there's no impact, there's no reason to be duplicative, I guess.
All these things that I'm highlighting right now, Madam Chair, is in essence spelled out in 32.19.32.01.
Okay.
Right there.
So not 6?
Mm-mm.
No.
No. 6, I think, is good. I mean, we do this regularly. I'm not sure other entities do, but I think when there was only us and we were a pharmacy affiliated program, I think that, I don't know if it'd be fair to require that of the other or or not. I mean, I like it in there. We already do it as a part of what we do, but that's because it's done through our foundation and that's part of our mission, so.
I agree. It's a good to have. I don't know if it needs to be in the rule.
Agreed.
Madam Chair, are you talking about this redlining as well? Or-
Yeah, yeah. So it looks like D is also required under the statute. So there's probably not a reason to keep that one there, right?
Mhm.
Dr. Gandhi, how do you feel about E?
I
And
think
is that
that's in
covered
the
in the
oth-
RFP?
I think that's in, you scroll up, Cam, a little bit on the left page, it says pursuant to a written request, release of all treatment records. I know it's covered in our contract too, but
I think the only reason we would request this is if someone wanted to appear, we had a question, they were not compliant. And that would be to present to you. And if the programs don't supply it to us, obviously they'll have to answer to the full board when we have the case presented to you. I'm not sure if it's needed.
Thoughts in the group? Keep it, leave it?
Take it out. It looks like it's covered.
Do we need to have F?
I think that's actually spelled out in the RFP.
Okay. Look at that. We got rid of like a whole page and a half.
All right.
Nice work, Kelly.
Anything else on this section from the group? Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate it. Dr. Gandhi, do we want to move on to the controlled substance monitoring program or go back to Dr. Dang?
Let's go to Mr. Dang. I think the controlled substance monitoring program will be a quick conversation. The work's already been done on that one.
Okay, sounds good. Dr. Dang, we skipped your section so that we would have the opportunity to hear from you. So we'll go back
Yes.
to yours. I know you
Yes.
provided some suggestions to Dr. Gandhi regarding R423 407.1 dispensing an opioid antagonist. So if you
Yes.
want to walk through your suggested changes, that would be appreciated.
Thanks. Thank you, Madam Chair. So this section is pretty straightforward. I pretty much updated the section with the ones that are written in red colors. As you can see under number 2, section A, I removed the verbiage, the existing verbiage, and replaced it with the statement that says the 2 most commonly used centrally acting opioid receptor antagonists are naloxone and naltrexone. The older version does not have naltrexone listed. And I went ahead and clarified to the public that the inhalation and injectable formulation of naloxone are FDA approved for the use in an opioid overdose and the reversal of respiratory depression associated with opioid use. Now, Naltrexone, I added this section so that the public is aware of the fact that it is available in both oral and long-acting injectable formulations, and it is FDA approved to treat opioid and or alcohol maintenance treatment. So that's something I think it is imperative for the public to be aware of, the fact that there are two reversal agents, not just one. And I, under number 3, so number 3, I just added 2 more terminologies under the symptoms, pallor, and dysarthria. So anytime when someone who is opioid overdose, their skin color changes, they look pale, and they have difficulty with their speech. So I added those 2 symptoms, and I kept everything else the same. And I also added the whole section under number 4 to help guide the community members, those who are at high risk for opioid overdose. So patients who are previously overdosed on opioid, patients who are taking high dosages of opioid for chronic pain treatment, patients who are taking opioids with CNS sedatives such as benzos, and patients who have underlying medical conditions such as heart disease, liver, or lungs disease. That whole section under number 4 was not on the original law book. And then some minor additions include, I added the licensed pharmacist and to section B, and I also added and training, added those training to the existing education to inform the pharmacist and the tech that the intern that aside from educating the patients on the opioid antagonist, they need to be trained on how to teach the patients, how to teach the users the proper way of administering this drug as well. And then under section B, I added number 4, which is opioid antagonist mechanism of action and its effect on human body. The current law book doesn't have this this section here. I think it's imperative that pharmacists or pharmacy interns need to be aware, need to have a solid understanding of the mechanism of action of the drug and how it affects the human body, so that we can convey the message to the patient when we dispense the drug. And that is pretty much it. Those are the new additions that I had added to the existing rules. Any questions?
I do. I have a question. I have a question about who the target audience is. Because when someone's looking up the rule, I think of them as being pharmacy professionals generally and not the public. And I feel like you're kind of tailoring towards public education. I don't know that the public is necessarily going to be seeking out the rule on this. I think 2 is a little lengthy just with that in mind. I think the rest of it, I think, is good.
Well, Kristin, number 2, the original verbiage did mention about naloxone. I mean, I can shorten it down by just saying that 2 most commonly used centrally acting opioid antagonists are naloxone and naltrexone, and leave it as that, if it's okay with other members in the committee.
This is
Now,
Mark.
Naltrexone is not currently in the statewide standing order. Mark, I don't know if that's where you were going to go, but go ahead with your comments.
No, so I get what you're trying to do there, Dr. Dang. It did say naloxone hydrochloride is an opioid antagonist, and you struck it. And I think what you were trying to do is like, look, there are other things. And so I think to sort of get to both issues of not singling out just naltrexone and frankly, the next drug technology that comes available that we don't know about yet, if we just leave it as opioid antagonist means any drug approved by the United States Food and Drug Administration that binds to opioid receptors, and then just let the sentence end before the red line.
Okay.
And that doesn't limit you. So to your point, Lori, now I'm getting to naltrexone. It's interesting. I noticed this when the statute was written by the legislature that naltrexone, and specifically long-acting naltrexone, it is included in 32-1979 by its language, but I think because of the standing order and the rulemaking, we've limited it to things that are reasonable for this purpose and not long-acting naltrexone. As big a fan as I am on Vivitrol and its application in our society, it would not be something that you would necessarily want to include in a standing order for a pharmacist and a patient to work together on. I would want a prescriber, whether it be an MD, DO, or mid-level, to assist with the treatment of a patient on long-acting naltrexone.
Okay.
If I may, is there an opportunity here to potentially codify, or maybe that can only be done in statute, but the clarification that the board has on its website right now about the bill that passed this past legislative session for reporting opioid antagonists to the PDMP. I know the board had to clarify in guidance that it only applies to naloxone, but I don't know, since we're kind of dealing with this section in rule right now, if maybe changing the definition could clarify that.
Or
I know this for prescribing.
Right, or if there's a place that we address it in perhaps the next section that Doug has too.
Yeah, I think that would be nice just for everybody to have, so that it's in the rule and you guys don't have to keep it on the website in the front page.
I do like Mark's input. So what about the other members in the committee? Are you in agreement with what Mark had suggested? Just to generically mention opioid receptor antagonist in number 2 and delete everything else that I have in that section?
I agree with Mark.
I agree.
Okay.
Me too.
All right. Thank you.
So Mark, where do I start and where do I end here? I'm sorry.
Oh, actually, Kevin made it really easy. So we're just striking from the original text. Naltrexone hydrochloride is an opioid antagonist. We're not including any of the new language that Kevin did. So you're starting, what you do if you have the actually on the screen in front of you, just after the word opioid, period, that's in black letters, delete all the red underline after that. Keep the strikeout for naltrexone hydrochloride is.
Hang on, buddy. Let me
all right.
Pull this big screen up, and then you can tell me on the screen on the right-hand side.
Yeah.
Which is the official language here.
Just the last sentence on 2.
All right, that fixes it.
That's it. Yep.
Okay.
And do we want this other educational stuff?
I had a couple of comments. So
go ahead, Kelly.
One, thank you. There's been a lot of effort to get naloxone out to as many people as possible, and make it available, not just by healthcare providers, but from community members. So like schools and police and fire, and then community centers recently, I think was last year or the year before. And so my concern with adding a bunch of extra things that pharmacists and drug experts have to do that these other maybe community members aren't having to do or aren't required to do, are we creating additional roadblocks of things that, you know, we should be counseling on any medication we dispense. And then, you know, making us more onerous for ourselves versus what, you know, other individuals have to do when they're trying to get this life-saving medication out there. I don't know that if we want to make it more strict. And then also there's a number of people that have already been trained, or there's already training programs that cover what was required, and now everyone's going to have to go back and add additional, potentially modified training programs and add additional content to that. And so the statute, the only thing that the statute requires the board to write rules on is dispensing. And then it refers to protocols, but we have the standing order that we refer to as far as which ones are approved and what the doses are. So I guess when I look at this, I would rather see it pared down to mimic what makes sense. And when it comes to like counseling, for example, just reference our, you know, required to do that per statute instead of spelling out everything that we need to cover, because we don't do that for other medications.
We're required to counsel on a new prescription anyway. So is it necessary that we specifically state everything that needs to be included in here? Because we should be counseling on all these points anyway.
Mm-hmm. And I think if we're still going to be requiring training, the training should cover some of that kind of stuff. It requires, you know, going over that with the individual as a refresher anyway. So I don't know that we need to spell out everything in there, knowing that we already have a statute that covers the consultation piece of it. And I don't know if the definitions, I don't know if those are already defined in statute, but that was my other thing. I didn't go back and look to see if it's included. Not just in ours, but I know that there's another section, 36-2266. So I don't know if somewhere within there it talks about or gives definitions for any of these that we could maybe mimic.
Any other thoughts on that particular section? So Kelly, what I'm hearing you say is you would not be in agreement with the proposed changes that Dr. Dang has offered here in section 3 and 4.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we have lay people going out on the street and handing out naloxone kits to people, they're not required to do any of this. And I mean, we have our set of statutes that already require us to do certain things for any prescription we dispense. So I think I would like to not see it go more in depth, but either don't make changes, tear it down potentially. That's just my opinion. And reference more, you know, this is more of a standard of care type of thing, you know, where.
So Kelly, just to clarify, your suggestion is to remove number 4, the high risk, patients at high risk, completely.
That's on
your proposed 4, yeah.
Yeah, that's on the left side.
Yep. What about the terminologies pallor and dysarthria? Should we leave them in there? Because the original verbiage has seizures, muscle spasm, and coma or death.
I mean, I don't know that we need to define these in our rule, but I mean, I don't necessarily oppose, making the definition clearer if we feel a definition is needed.
Mhm.
I don't,
So-
I don't have a problem with it. I question whether we need to have these definitions at all in the rule. My guess is it's maybe already mentioned in statute and or it's sort of implied as to what opioid-related overdose may be.
Mhm.
So.
So here's my take on this section. This section is not too long and complicated to begin with. That's the reason why I thought adding more clarifications to the definition would help the pharmacist, would help guide the pharmacists and the interns. So that's the reason why I decided to add to elaborate more on the high risk and the symptoms. If this section is 2 or 3 pages long, trust me, I'm gonna try my best to eliminate as much as I can.
I think one thing to keep in mind, guys, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, but we have a requirement of 3 CE hours for opioid substance use disorder. I'm sorry, as these folks that do these 3 CEs every 2 years, they're gonna cover a lot of these topics already, is my take.
I agree with you. And just to remind the group that the statewide standing order that's issued by the Department of Health allows a pharmacist to dispense naloxone to any individual in conditions with the order. And so it doesn't even have to be somebody at risk for an opioid overdose. It could be anyone.
It could be a neighbor.
It could be somebody that just wants to have it in case they're near somebody that has an overdose. I mean, and to Kelly's point, there are lay persons that are handing this out today with other programs and things like that with our harm reduction agencies. So I would be supportive of not making it more difficult. I understand where you're trying to come from, Dr. Deng, and I appreciate that. But I think the goal should be to make sure that it's as broadly as available as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts?
I think a lot of this will come up in counseling when you're telling the person how to use the product correctly and what the symptoms are. And I think for the folks in the community that hand these out at community centers, et cetera, they probably give some training or documentation too. So I think both instances are covered and I feel comfortable with how it is.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is Mark. My only advice would be to even make the definition less specific to get at the public policy goal is let's make pharmacists comfortable giving this out to anyone who asks for it. And I saw the word triad of symptoms and I'm like, did we get that from the DSM-5 or where did it come from? Because candidly, when I was trained as a paramedic many years ago, anybody who was unconscious got Narcan, glucose, and thiamine. That's all I needed. I just needed them to be unconscious. And so I wonder if opioid-related overdose simply means any acute condition that's caused by an opioid dose that's not tolerated well by the patient, and then we're done. I don't know. Or we
I don't
just
even know if it's not even defined in the statute to give like other providers the ability to dispense and prescribe standing orders. They don't even define opioid-related overdose, or they just mention naloxone, hydrochloride, or any other opioid antagonist that's approved by the U.S. Food and Drug, but they don't define it anywhere. I'm wondering, do we even need these definitions? I think people know what that is. That's kind of my opinion, but
So that's a good point, Kelly. I mean, so is opioid related overdose used below the definition section A? And if so, what's its context? Oh, so there it is. It's in B5. Reports of seeking emergency medical assistance for an overdose before or after administering the opioid antagonist.
So Mark, to answer your question regarding the triad of symptoms, those symptoms came from CDC and World Health Organization.
Oh, so that's a definition we borrowed from one of their publications?
Yep.
Got it.
CDC.
Are we making this more difficult than it needs to be? The statute is pretty simple. It's pretty, there's not a lot of rules that are really required for this. And the statewide standing order basically says a pharmacist can provide it to anybody. Are we making this more difficult than it needs to be? I mean, we have to obviously document dispensing for any type of time we dispense a prescription. It instructs that in addition to what our normal dispensing policies would be, that the individual, this is within the statute, that the pharmacist needs to instruct the individual to summon emergency services as soon as possible after administering it. Other than the training, I don't know that the rest of this is really necessary. I don't know, just thinking out loud.
I agree.
I think that's right. I think if there's an opportunity to reduce the number of regulations, the words, we should. And the intent has always been get naloxone into as many hands as possible, just in case you're in a situation where it's going to come in handy.
Do we just reference that a pharmacist can provide an opioid antagonist without a prescription pursuant to a protocol and reference the statute and then have the section on training?
You do need, though, section E.
Yes, I agree with that.
About D, where it gives them protection for administering if they experience somebody that's having an overdose.
I think that's in the statute.
Yeah, that's section D in the statute. A pharmacist who dispenses an opioid antagonist pursuant to this section is immune for professional liability in criminal prosecution for any decision, act, or omission or injury that results from this act if the pharmacist acts within reasonable good care and good faith, except in cases of wanton or willful neglect.
Does it say dispense or does it say administer?
Oh, dispense.
Dispenser, yeah, you're right then, because we would want the pharmacist to be able to administer it if they were down, if they had a patient down in a store or something.
When I look at this section, I haven't heard any, and Kelly, you may have heard or not heard, I don't know, but I haven't heard any concerns about just limiting people from getting trained, dispensing it. It may add words, or if we don't do anything, it leaves words in there, but I haven't seen it impact anything negatively. So I don't know if we really need to touch it even.
So maybe the solution is just a simple strikeout of naloxone in that first sentence then.
Yeah,
And that second section under what an opioid antagonist is to make it broader. Any other thoughts?
I only had one question for Mark. I want to know what he, as growing up, what he did not do. Because he always mentions he's a paramedic, he's this, he's that, he's that. It'd be a shorter list if you told us what he didn't do.
Never got to fly an airplane. Like I flew in an airplane, but I never actually got to pilot it.
All right, anything else on that, Madam Chair, or anybody?
I don't have anything further. Thanks, Kevin, for your work on this one.
Thank you very much.
All right. I think our last one is the CSPMP related sections. So is Doug on the line or somebody from his team to address the suggestions there?
I can take care of it, Madam Chair.
Okay, great.
A lot of this stuff that is redlined, and you'll see a ton of red line in this section. I'll just go through it and then I'll speak to it. All of these things that are redlined out is spelled out in statute. So again, it's just repetitive language. There was some point of clarification. For instance, this line right here, and this wasn't spelled out in statute or anything like that, but it needed a tracking system. It does reference a statute, but Jessica Bell at the time felt that we needed it. She's no longer with us, but she felt some of these things were not clear in statute, and so she wanted to be further thorough in our regulations. Having reviewed this, I thought she did an awesome job actually referencing everything and eliminating and adding where needed.
So section E is new. Can you speak to that one, Cam?
Yep, I'm just reading it right now. So if their DA registration was revoked, suspended, or had discipline on it with restrictions, or their medical license had some sort of restrictions, there was nothing in stating that we can suspend or close out the registration. So we felt that needed to be in there because nothing gave us the authority to suspend somebody's CSPMP access.
And that would be any licensee.
Any
It has
license
access.
that had, correct.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
But does it? I mean, aren't there situations in which a prescriber who might not write for controlled substances would value the input from that system?
We discussed this. I'm trying to find my notes, like maybe during the definitions. Hold on. Other people can speak because I think it might take me a while to find.
Well, the first part of it, Mark, to address your concern is they have an expired, suspended, or revoked medical practice license. So they shouldn't be practicing medicine anyways. The second part of it is one of the requirements to access the CSPMP, and it's in statute, is you have to have the appropriate license to prescribe as well as a DA registration. If you don't have those two components, you can't, by definition, in statute, have access to the PMP anyways.
Unless you're a health plan.
Unless you're a health plan now, yes, as of this
No, that's fair. If it's in statute, I get it then. No problem.
Yeah, let's not go down that rabbit hole about health plans, but I agree with that. I mean, the CSTMP should only be used for the purposes of taking care of patients, and if you don't have a license, you shouldn't need access to it.
And if you need both, the license and the DEA registration, I get it. That's fine. If that's what the statute says, that's what the statute says.
Okay.
I think the only question we had,
Hey, Cam, go back up. Scroll back up for a sec. Under that beginning section of 502.
502.
No, down now.
Going. Here we go.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I thought the ASAP version was wrong based on what the current standard is. So it looks like we struck all that and just we have it less specific,
Correct.
right? Okay, that makes sense.
We talked about this at some point, but I don't remember where we landed on it, but I think all of us had some concerns around the language of the date the prescription was sold in A5.
Yeah, so I think that was something that we were going to pursue in statute, wasn't it, Cam, from the CSTMP task force? Or is that in my head?
It may need to be adjusted in statute as well, but if it's in statute, we'll remove it and put it there. But it was discussed at the last task force meeting to try to capture the fill date as well as the sold date.
So that way there wasn't ambiguity about what the date sold really was.
Exactly. We did have a question on one area here. Statutorily, 362603, the board is supposed to put a task force together comprising of certain members, and it's on an annual basis. Obviously, the committee felt they may need to meet more than once a year. Number of members on that task force, did we want to limit that to a certain number? Because at some point it gets to be unmanageable and you simply don't get anything done because you have too many people.
Yeah, Cam, that was in my notes, both the frequency and how the committee was comprised. I was kind of surprised leading that task force, I guess, who all participated in it and the composition, and also to your point, the size. Do you have a recommendation? I've only participated in the one. Kelly, I know you participate in them regularly. Do you have a suggestion there?
I think Doug and I were talking about it, and we came up with somewhere between 12 and 15 at the most. But I don't know, what are your thoughts?
Do you have any thoughts? I mean, 12 people is a lot to get together for a meeting. I mean, even scheduling just this size of a committee, I know can be a challenge.
I think
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
No, go for it.
I think there's about that many people that usually show up, but I know the list is like, there's probably 30 some people on there. So I know everyone wants kind of a seat at the table to kind of weigh in. But I think it should be as little as possible to make sure that we're accounting for all of the different stakeholders that may want to be there.
I think one of the concerns, Madam Chair, is you have all the health boards, first of all, the prescribing health boards and the pharmacy board. That alone takes up around 5 or 6 seats. And then you have DEA, you have AG's office. Then you have, of course, the association. So Kelly, ARMA, and all those other folks that have it. So you can easily take up 12 seats just from those folks alone. So I don't know your thoughts. I mean, I think 12 or 15, based on the list of statutory requirements of who can participate, can easily be filled. But I don't want to go beyond 15. It just gets a little too much to manage.
What if it's as designate does it have to be a number, or could it be as appointed by the board president or the executive director or something like that?
As determined by the board.
Yeah, and then we have the opportunity if it becomes an issue for scheduling to address that. I don't know, just a thought. And my thought on the timing is it definitely needs to be at least once a year. I think right now it's probably not frequent enough, honestly.
No, I agree. And I believe it says at least once a year. So I think you guys, the task force, determine at least, well, more than that. So I believe Doug has the notes on that. And he's perfectly willing to put it together if he has to meet even 2 or 3 times a year. Yeah, this one's going to be a tricky one. If we leave it up to the board, are we going to vote on it annually, saying this year we're going to have 12, next year we're going to have 13? I'm not sure how it's going to play out. I almost feel like a number is required. Want me to get with Doug, and as we do a final draft of this, I'll highlight it and give you a specific number on who exactly needs to appear based on statute.
That makes sense to me.
Okay, we'll do that. Any other questions on this? Or are you guys okay with us moving forward with all these revisions?
Cam, on that, what you were just talking about, the size of the task force,
Right.
you, in 36-2603, it does specify certain groups, but it doesn't but it's not specific as to how many from each group. I think 2603A, list 1 through 7, highlights different groups that are required to be part of the task force, but it's not clear as to how many from each. So you may want to reference back to that statute when looking at that.
Can we state in there saying only 1 vote per group will count versus them bringing an entire entourage of people and each one gets a vote?
Well, the board, under that statute, the board shall appoint the task force, the board being the pharmacy board.
Right.
And the task force shall include, so I think it's up to the board to make up what they feel is appropriate for the task force, as long as they cover those 7 kind of sections.
Yep. So we'll itemize that list, 7 list under 36-2603 and figure out a number. May need to add another bullet point to this saying each group shall only carry 1 vote. And that would be allowed, right? So to spell that out.
Possibly, right? Well, actually, it looks like under these, yeah, I might have to look at it, because under one of the categories, it's representatives of professional societies and associations for pharmacists, medical practitioners, and other licensed healthcare providers. So even though it's 7, there could be
Yeah, I was just reading that too, Seth.
representatives of professional licensing boards. So it,
representatives of Arizona Health Cost Containment System Administration, representatives.
Yeah, so you're gonna have to work around that statute.
And I don't think by rule, you could limit who is allowed to vote if everyone has membership on the task force.
I have 23 members from my team alone. So are you saying in theory we have 23 votes, Gene?
And you and I have discussed that previously.
I know. Let me take it up with Gene and Seth, sidebar, and then we'll bring it back to you guys on that one little subject matter.
Thanks, Kim.
I think, Madam Chair, that's the song and dance today. I don't think we have anything else left.
I got here just in time.
Fashionably late.
All right. Any further discussion?
No, I thank you all for working on your assignments, and helps me out a great deal. So I do appreciate you guys for it.
Sorry, I lost you guys there for a second. Any other discussion on any of the other topics or anything further on this one?
When's the next one?
Yeah, give me a chance to breathe a little bit, Roger. I got to put this together.
No, that's fine.
I really appreciate everybody's being prepared, coming to the meeting ready to discuss your assigned sections. I think it makes it much easier, and I do think it allows us to meet a little bit more frequently so that there's less pre-work for Dr. Gandhi. So appreciate everybody's continued commitment to this, and we will adjourn at 3:16.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye.